Hello and welcome to this first video revision for multiculturalism. So we're going to talk through a number of things in these videos, go through some of the key points from the course, but we're just going to start with the big question. So what is multiculturalism? What are the key things we've got to remember? And this video will introduce some of the kind of major debates about why some people think it's a good thing, the answer to some of society's problems, and indeed why other people see it as a big problem. Now, the first thing we've got to remember is that people get confused between multiculturalism and a multicultural society. So it's so important that we understand these are two very different things. On the screen here in the video, you can see a picture of a multicultural society. Right? People from lots of different countries, lots of different ethnicities, religions, perhaps speak different languages, living side by side. And this is what we have in many countries around the world today, especially Britain, but places like America, France, Canada, Spain, Italy, Germany, lots and lots of countries could be described as multicultural. Now, where multiculturalism fits in as a political ideology is in answer to this question. How do we make a multicultural society work? How can you make this work as a country? How can we have lots of different people with potentially different ideas, different cultures, different values? How can we live still together as a society happily? And the best way, and I think maybe the easiest way to start thinking and remembering about multiculturalism is to see it alongside its opposite, which is assimilation. So these are both approaches, political approaches, decisions and actions that can be taken by a government in order to deal with a multicultural society and to make it function. So first of all, multiculturalism believes when you've got a multicultural society, you have to encourage tolerance. You've got to help everybody and encourage everybody to tolerate each other, even if they have very different ideas and values to you, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything. Tolerance is really important. Multiculturalism celebrates minority cultures and diversity. That is to say that it sees it as a good thing, a strength of a country, something to be celebrated, something to increase that idea of diversity and difference. Thirdly, it says here, respect different views and ways of life. Now, this goes further than just tolerance. Tolerance just suggests that we, kind of accept people being different. But multiculturalism really wants us to respect each other, respect that there are people that hold different views to us. And they think that's super important in order to create societal cohesion. And last but not least, multiculturalism believes that it is the state's responsibility to empower minority cultures. But also it's up to the state to make all of these things on the left-hand side work, right? It's the state's responsibility to help the majority culture to respect, celebrate, and encourage and accept differences. Now, many people find this kind of nonsensical, think it can never possibly work, and have a very opposite way of thinking about making a multicultural society function. So we can think about this with the idea of assimilation. So a few examples here of what assimilation might look like in Britain in particular. So assimilationists, people that believe in this idea, would want to encourage minority immigrant cultures to become more British. They would say that the only way to make society function is that people adopt and become part of the majority culture. Second point down, they would expect people to speak English and to adopt British values. So this is the idea that we can have immigration, we can have lots of different people living in the same country, but it will only work if those people accept and embrace some core values that are seen to represent what a country means, so British values. And then thirdly, we can see here this idea of discouraging separate neighbourhoods and communities. Assimilation believes that what you need to do is get people to become the same as quickly as possible or as much as possible, right? So we can see here some very different ideas. So before we move on, let's just recap then we have multicultural societies like we do in Britain, and we now need an approach. We now need to think, how can we make this function? Do we either accept, celebrate, encourage difference, or do we try to minimize that difference and try to make everyone more similar and adopt and become part of the majority culture? Okay, so with that in mind, let's think about why multiculturalism has developed, because it's quite a new political theory. So unlike some of the other ones that you study, like socialism, conservatism, liberalism, those are very old ideas, some of them going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Whereas multiculturalism really is just a phenomenon from the last 50 or so years. And it's developed due to some particular contexts that we have seen develop since World War II. So although we did have multicultural societies before World War II, and you've had multicultural societies throughout history, the levels of migration to countries like Britain after World War II grew to levels that had previously not been seen in the world. And indeed, that continues to this day. We have higher levels of migration and movement around the world today than we've ever had. So what that did was created very quickly societies which had lots of very different people. If we take Britain, for example, after World War II, lots of people came, most of them encouraged and facilitated by the British government, came to Britain from ex-colonies. So the British Empire and other empires around the world were crumbling, but countries that used to be part of these colonies, part of the empire, would often go to the what was seen as the mother country. This happened in France, this happened in many places. So countries like Britain were facing and thinking about a society which was new, which included lots of difference, and so people had to think, well, how do we make this work? We've never had this before. So that's the starting point. Now, we could say that the second step on this kind of pathway towards multiculturalism is that the initial attempts at assimilation were argued, at least, to have failed. And you can see a picture local to us here of Smethwick, local communities here, Asian communities in particular, faced huge amounts of racism, huge amounts of poverty, lack of opportunities, discrimination. And so it got people thinking, both people inside minority cultures, but also people in politics and government and academics began to think, okay, well, we need to think about a different approach. Assimilation isn't working. We are facing these big problems, racism, poverty, etc. And built into that context is the kind of academic and political culture of the 1960s and 70s, where you had things like feminism, you had peace movements, you had fights towards gender, sexuality, inclusion and diversity. And so within that context, you had people questioning, well, who gets to decide what is wrong and what's right? Who gets to decide what values society follows? Maybe we need a complete reassessment of those things. So whilst feminists questioned the male-dominated patriarchy of a traditional culture, we could say, people began to think about, well, who gets to decide what is right and what's wrong in Britain? Who gets to decide what is Britishness? And out of all these kind of combined factors came the theory of multiculturalism. And in other videos, we'll explore how it develops. There's lots of different versions of multiculturalism. But important for us to remember that this is a new idea that has been born out of a new problem, or what is seen as a problem, and ties in with lots of progressive, perhaps more modern, challenging views of how to develop society and move forward from a more traditional, old-fashioned way of life. So far then we've thought about what multiculturalism is, kind of where it's coming from. And before we move on to the end of the video, just want to try and at this moment be really clear that this is controversial. This is an idea that lots of people really hate, and of course lots of people really love. But particularly in recent times, we've had lots of criticism of multiculturalism. So it's not just a kind of a simple idea of, oh, let's make a country nice, let's be kind to each other, let's be respectful, multiculturalism has some pretty strong, interesting ideas which create controversy and indeed create hatred from lots of people. So really important not to just think of this as a kind of a soft idea, but as a distinct political ideology with people that really support it and people that really oppose it, just like with socialism, for example. So we can see here I've just got some news stories to think about. This is one from just this year or last year, I think. It says, multiculturalism is damaging our society. And then if you look at the line underneath, it says, it was foolish to think we could integrate so many people from different cultures in so little time. So this writer feels like multiculturalism is creating too many problems. It's making society fracture and become unworkable. It's not just commentators, though. We have had political leaders. So Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, David Cameron, leader of Britain in the early 2010s, both came out and said multiculturalism has failed. They said that this experiment to try and be open, try to accept difference, was just creating more problems than it was solving. And this is a bit more of a kind of a clickbait article I found, but you see people, making big claims. Multiculturalism is tearing Britain apart. So one of the big thoughts we've got for this part of our A-level is, can multiculturalism work? Why do some people think it does work? Why do some people have these strong views that it's a big problem and that it needs to be stopped as an idea? And we'll finish this video with a little overview of some of those arguments. Before we do that, I think it's important just to get a couple of keywords really clear in our minds. And I think these two keywords actually represent perhaps the whole idea we're trying to think about in this video. On the one hand, we have the idea of universalism. So this is the idea that certain values and principles apply to everyone within a society. There are universal rights and universal wrongs. Now, if you believe that, then you have a problem with multiculturalism, because multiculturalism actually believes in what we could talk about as cultural relativism. And that is to say that the values of each individual culture should be judged by the context of that culture alone. The state should not decree any single culture as morally superior. So if you believe in multiculturalism, you reject universalism. You say there is no such thing as right and wrong. Different cultures have different views and we need to accept and embrace that. If you believe that there is one way of doing things, one way of thinking, one set of principles that are right and others that are wrong, then you're going to reject the ideas of multiculturalism that believe, it's not up to us, not up to the states, not up to anyone to define and to tell people how to live their lives. So with those ideas in mind, let's look through some of the big arguments. First of all, let's start on the critique of multiculturalism. Some people think multiculturalism is the problem. So what would they say? Now, we will go into some of these ideas in a bit more detail in other videos, so a quick run through here for now. These are all arguments, these aren't facts, but people that don't like multiculturalism would say that it erodes national identity, it threatens traditional values, and therefore it leads to a disunited country. People that believe in this look back in history, look back in the kind of rear-view mirror and think, oh, it was a better world before, and that culture we used to have, where everyone was together, that is being eroded when we don't have a single identity and a single set of values. They argue that multiculturalism creates isolated, segregated communities that distrust each other. And they argue that that then leads to increased tension and a lack of social cohesion. So what that means is multiculturalism supports the idea of people being able to live their own lives within their own cultures. And people that don't like that idea or see it as a problem say, well, all you're going to get then is a whole bunch of segregated communities that don't mix with each other. And when you have that, they distrust each other, and that then leads to tension, perhaps even violence, and certainly doesn't help towards making people feel as one and cohesive as a society. One of the big critiques, and I'd say probably the biggest one at the moment, is people say that multiculturalism tolerates and excuses oppressive and dangerous ideas. And this is really prevalent at the moment and particularly focuses on certain aspects of, or things that are seen as certain aspects of Islam, and some people's interpretation of Islam. So to be clear, obviously not all of Islam or all Muslim people, but we see it all the time in the news and people commentating that multiculturalism doesn't do enough to challenge and question views which are seen as dangerous and oppressive, whether that's about women's rights or whether that's about in our modern world, about anti-Semitism, about support for terrorism or what is seen as terrorism in places like Palestine, Gaza. So this is a really big issue, and I think, just a quick note, I think it's important to separate this point when we talk about one particular religion, in this case Islam, with the broader thoughts about multiculturalism. And I'm not sure that many people that critique multiculturalism have big problems with other cultures. And so it's an interesting kind of aside, I think, to kind of consider. People think that multiculturalism creates anger, resentment amongst the majority culture. So they would say it unnecessarily annoys the majority culture. They then feel resentment. They turn against minority cultures. So this argument actually says that multiculturalism creates racism, or makes racism more likely. And finally, last but not least, some people have a problem with multiculturalism because they say it categorizes people by overemphasizing group identity, limiting their personal development. So what this means is, they say, well, if as a multiculturalist you tell someone that they are X or Y, and you try and tell them, okay, it's great, you have to, you should live your life as a whatever it might be, a certain religion, certain ethnicity, certain culture. Well, actually, what you're doing is you're limiting their own personal independence and individuality. You're kind of putting someone in a group, in a bracket, and that makes it harder for them to actually live their lives and to develop as an individual within a society. So let's see what the response is. Why do other people think multiculturalism actually is the solution to some of the problems that we see in multicultural societies? Well, one of the big arguments is they argue that it is the only way to help minority cultures feel valued and accepted. And when this happens, it leads to individuals and communities being able to thrive. So as an individual person or as a community that is a minority, unless you are valued and accepted, you aren't able, so this argument goes, to really fulfill your potential, to feel positive and optimistic about your position in the world. Secondly, multicultural thinkers argue that it actually creates social cohesion, as through multiculturalism, people understand and respect each other better. So that's going to reduce ignorance and prejudice. Okay, the more that the state helps people to understand each other, helps to make difference accepted and celebrated, you are going to help the people of the country to kind of follow in that mode and to understand and respect each other. People that believe multiculturalism is the solution say it's actually just pure racist and offensive to tell people from another culture what to believe and how to act. And anything but multiculturalism will just lead to minority cultures feeling resentful. So if you come from a minority culture, someone tells you, or the government tells you, or you hear in society, however that might be, that your way of living, that your way of thinking is wrong. Well, multiculturalists say that's not going to do anything positive. And in fact, it's just going to make people feel resentful, not part of society, and it's actually going to create more problems. So multiculturalism, which makes people feel accepted, is the only way to make people feel part of the nation. People that believe in multiculturalism say that it makes for a richer, more diverse and culturally interesting country. And finally, they argue that the economy, society, and all these kind of things are improved when we have new perspectives, when we celebrate that there are different ways of thinking, This makes every part of our country improve. So there are some of the arguments. It's going to get a little bit more complicated as we go through these videos in our revision, but there's a good starting point to think about some of the big questions like, does multiculturalism work? Can multiculturalism work? Why do some people see multiculturalism as a failed ideology? These are some of the big thoughts that you need to make sure you've got an opinion and understanding of.